Which states' congressional districts most closely reflected the popular vote they received from the midterms? Today on Political Access, we're going to go through one more of these spreadsheets and one more map. I've compiled all of the data. Be sure to take a look at my previous video. The spreadsheet on the screen right now is from that video. The video will also be down below in the description. But what I do is take the statewide popular vote for the U.S. House, and I use that to estimate how many seats each party should have in a given state. I know there's a lot of data here. I do explain it in the previous video, but once I set it up, all of it's automatically calculated, so there's not going to be any other kind of biases in here. It simply is going to reflect how much vote each party got in a state and how many seats they ended up with. Now, in states with 2, 3, or 4 districts, it's very easy where one district will swing that vote a lot. This does attempt to account for that. Now, what I do is I take these two columns over here on the right, and I simply multiply them together. So, for example, in Alabama, Republicans are ahead 9/10 of a seat, and that comes out to 12.5% of the population. So we'll multiply those together and get the final result of the bias. Now, before you say, hey, you forgot about this or that, I understand nothing is going to be perfect. Two things I will mention that could skew the results. Some states the candidates ran unopposed. Therefore, there's some Democratic or Republican vote that is not reflected in the total statewide vote. It's unfortunate, but all I can do is take the results that are there, and hopefully, over all of the states, things will generally even out. Same thing in a state like California, where sometimes there's 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans in the general election. That could skew it as well. Now, 2 things this is not going to tell us. It's not going to tell us how the geography of a state reflects these biases, and it is also not going to account for districts that were very marginal within a couple of points, either way of flipping or not flipping. So there's so many different metrics, but again, I focus on the statewide partisan vote. How well is that reflected in the number of seats held? I think that's the best way to do it, and I hope you'll appreciate this for what it is. I have all 44 states with at least 2 congressional districts ranked. So we're going to start off with a map and see which states are the worst. If you want to just skip to the spreadsheet with all the data, you can do that toward the end of the video. There will be a chapter for it down below in the description. So let's switch over to the map. Now, what I will say is there's only one midterm we have results for. We can do this again in the next midterm to see how things change. There's other things you can look at, but again, I think this is probably the best way to do it to see where there's at least a clear indication that one party or the other got screwed out of some extra seats. So the best states are going to have a low percentage here. And the states with the higher percentage, those are generally going to be worse offenders. And again, it should generally account for everything based on state size, number of districts, and population that is over or underrepresented in the U.S. House. Higher percentages don't necessarily mean blatant gerrymanders, but once you get to the highest percentages, it's very hard to come up with any other explanation aside from egregious gerrymandering. So the most biased states will be these solid dark colors. Those will be a 50% or more bias. The regular solid colors will be a 30 to 49.9% bias. The light colors will be a 10 to 29.9% bias, and the light red and blue colors, we'll say those are the tilt margins, those will be 5 to 9.9% bias. But the best states, those will be the green color, there are 7 of them, those were under a 5% bias. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on each state. Again, you can look at the data for yourself. But the absolute best state on here was Minnesota. It was nearly as perfect as it gets. And in Minnesota, Democrats got 50.1% of the popular vote statewide. Republicans got 48.1%, close to a 50-50 split. There's 8 districts. Each party won 4 of them. So that's about as good as it gets. Very close correlation between statewide popular vote and number of seats won. So Minnesota only had a 0.1% bias. That is phenomenal stuff. The second best state actually was North Carolina. Republicans won slightly more vote there, but both parties did win 7 seats. So the statewide popular vote is accurately reflected in the number of congressional districts held for each party in North Carolina. Now, the 5 other states that were under 5% were Virginia, Michigan, New York, Colorado, and Mississippi. So if anything changed in those states, if one party or another won 1 or less extra seat, that would definitely affect these numbers. If the popular vote won for each party changed more than 1 or 2%, that would also change these numbers. So given how these states voted, the vote overall was very accurately reflected in the number of congressional seats held. Now for the tilt states, that's again 5 to 9.9%. Democrats had 2 of them, Pennsylvania and in Oregon. Republicans had one, that is in Arizona. So those states, the vote was very closely represented, but there's a little bit of a tilt one way or the other. The next states are the lean margins. Those had a bias of 10% to 29.9. So starting with the least bias at 10.6%, that is Louisiana for the Republicans. Now, increasing from there, we have Alabama, Kansas, Texas, Ohio, Missouri, and Idaho for the Republicans. Next, we have one for the Democrats. It's actually tied with the same bias at 19%, and that is for the Democrats in Hawaii. Next, back to the Republicans. Kentucky, Georgia, West Virginia, Wisconsin, South Carolina, Indiana. And one more state here in this range, and that is for the Democratic bias, and that is in Nevada, 29.5%. Now, to the likely states, or the solid colors. These are the states where the unfairness does really start to go up, and one party or the other is getting screwed. The first state is Montana. That is a 32.6% bias for the Republicans. Next is Maine. That's a 33.6% bias for the Democrats. Now, both Maine and Montana have two districts, and both of them have one party holding both of those districts. So given the amount of vote that the opposing party has received, it does indicate that that's a decent amount of bias where the other party is completely not getting represented. The next state at 36.7% is Arkansas for the Republicans. Next state at 38.5% is Rhode Island for the Democrats. The next state at 39.9% for the Republicans is Nebraska. Now we're in the top 14 states. These are all over 40%. So number 14 at 40.5% for the Democrats is Maryland. Number 13 at 40.6% for the Democrats is New Hampshire. Number 12 at 41.1% for the Republicans is Florida. Now there's a tie for number 10 at 48.4%. One of them is for the Democrats, that is Washington. The other one is for the Republicans, and that is Utah. Now let's go on to number 9, the 48.5% bias for the Democrats. It is New Jersey. At number 8, at 49.8% bias in favor of the Republicans, it is Tennessee. Now the final 7 states are the absolute most egregious offenders. These will be the darkest colors. And number 7 at 51.8% is Oklahoma. That is a state where there are 5 congressional districts. Democrats hold none of them, and given the amount of vote share Democrats received to have 0 representation, that does amount to a substantial bias, and that is reflected here at 51.8%. Number 6 at 58.4% in favor of the Democrats is New Mexico. That is a state with 3 congressional districts. Democrats hold all 3. Republicans have enough vote there, and they're being shut out of all 3. Now, real quick comparison here. Oklahoma and New Mexico, both of them have one party shutting out the other. Oklahoma has 5 congressional districts. New Mexico has 3. The reason New Mexico is higher bias is because there's just more Republican vote there in New Mexico than there is Democratic vote in Oklahoma. But again, these are both bad states. New Mexico just happens to be slightly more unfair. Now for the top 5. Number 5 at 81% bias for the Democrats, it is Massachusetts. That is a state where there's 9 congressional districts. Republicans are not going to hold any. Again, this does not take into account how many districts were close. In the case of Massachusetts, there were none still. And again, it does not take into account geography. All it does is take into account the total statewide Republican vote that was not represented. They're going to go 0 for 9, and that is an 81% bias. Next, number 4 at 81.4% bias, it is Iowa. Now, that is a state that has 4 congressional districts. Democrats will hold none of them. Of course, they were close in definitely one of the districts, sort of close in 2 more. That is not reflected. What is reflected is none of the Democratic vote in Iowa will translate into any congressional seats held. That comes out to an 81.4% bias. Number 3, at 88.8% bias in favor of the Democrats, it is Connecticut. That is a state with 5 districts. Republicans have none. Even though they got close in 1, there's enough Republican vote there to where they should definitely have 1 seat, probably 2. They don't have any. That is a major bias. Number 2, with 93.8% bias in favor of the Democrats, it is California. They have 52 districts. Republicans do have a lot of vote there, and their number of seats they will hold is not close to what they should be holding. That ends up being a lot of vote that is gypped out of any extra representation. And finally, the absolute worst state on here, I don't think this is a surprise, at 115.3% in favor of the Democrats, it is Illinois. And although I've labeled that the worst, most gerrymandered state in the country, I went into this just plugging in the data to see what would happen, and Illinois ended up being the worst. Republicans only hold 3 seats out of 17 there. There's a lot of Republican vote that is just not going to have any representation. It is definitely the worst map on here, but these top 10 or 15, those are all pretty bad. And now we can switch over here to the spreadsheet. In the section on the left, those are again just the 2 columns from the right side from the sheet at the beginning of the video, as well as the previous video. I did change the column headings to district bias and district bias percentage. Then we have the total bias here. Those are the percentages I plugged into the map. And over here on the right side, those are all the states in order from worst to best. So what are the takeaways here? Well, I think there's a few. Well, the worst offenders mostly are Democratic states, and it's clear Republicans should have a few more seats here in Illinois, California, Connecticut. If everything was perfect, they should probably have more than 10 seats out of those 3 states alone. Now, Republicans, their offending is more so done in smaller population states, so a lot of those do add up to the number of seats as well. But then there are some states that some people might be surprised by. Texas only has a 12.5% bias. And I think that does kind of confirm that there's a lot of Republican vote in Texas. And even though the map does favor the Republicans, Democrats did get almost the number of seats they should have in Texas. It's definitely possible in a different year the map could expose more Republican bias there, but at least in this last midterm, Texas is not a bad map at all, and compared to its reputation, it's actually a far better map than that even. So you could draw some conclusions here. Some states are a little bit more surprising, some are less surprising. It's nice to see some states ended up being very fair. That might change during the next election. I could plug in data from any future elections on it. I could even take a look at the previous cycle, but I would have to adjust this for the redistricting. But I did enjoy this. I like getting the hard data and seeing where the biases are. One other way to look at this is if all the states voted at large for congressional districts, these results are how far away they are from that ideal at-large correlation. And I know some people are going to hate this for some reason because they wanted this tweak or that tweak, but this is what you've got. I think it's pretty good. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about this data? Which states do you think were the most biased or the least biased? Which states maybe had the best or worst geography for redistricting? Let me know down below. And if you enjoy this channel, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next video.